Hello, my name is Leo Vance. I'm 38 years old. If you were to ask me to describe the life I've lived, I would tell you it has been like a rugged, unforgiving path where a few moments of brilliant sunshine were interspersed with wounds that never quite seemed to heal. I was born in a forgotten corner of South Boston, a place where grand aspirations were often ground down by the relentless machinery of poverty and the sheer, grinding hardship of life. But I swore to myself from a young age that I would never allow my circumstances to become the definitive chapter of my story. This narrative isn't just about me, it's also about the things I fought so desperately to hold on to, and the pieces of myself I lost along the way. I grew up in a neighborhood where the triple-decker houses stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning against one another, as if fighting for their small patch of sky, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air often carried the briny scent of the nearby harbor, a constant reminder of a world that was vast and indifferent. My father was a plumber, a man whose hands were perpetually calloused and stained, a testament to a lifetime of honest, back-breaking labor. My mother worked part-time at a local grocery store, her smile a small beacon of warmth in our often chilly apartment. They didn't have much in the way of material wealth, but I was their entire world. They instilled in me a fundamental truth. If I ever wanted to break free from the gravitational pull of poverty, I would have to build my own ladder, rung by painful rung. So I worked. I worked with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I remember the countless long nights, hunched over books and ledgers under the dim, yellow glow of a single desk lamp in my cramped room, the city's distant hum a backdrop to my silent mantra, I will make it, I will get out. Accounting was never the dream that set my soul on fire, but I saw it for what it was, a pragmatic, ironclad ticket to a better life. It was a language of numbers, a world of order and logic that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of my surroundings. I outworked, outstudied, and out-hustled everyone in my class. When I finally graduated from college with honors, walking across that stage to receive my diploma felt like reaching up and touching a distant star. As I stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, I imagined my parents in the crowd, their faces etched with a pride so profound it could have powered the city. But deep down, a quiet, persistent voice whispered that my journey, the real test, was only just beginning. And then I met Clara Sterling. My God, she was like a creature from another dimension, a world I had only glimpsed on television screens or in glossy magazines. It was her golden blonde hair that caught the light just so, a smile that could illuminate the darkest corners of a room, and a way of speaking, confident but never arrogant, poised but never cold, that left me utterly captivated. We met at a financial seminar in downtown Boston. I was there as a hungry, ambitious nobody, desperately seeking an opportunity, a foothold in a world that seemed determined to keep me out. She was there representing Sterling Investments, the financial empire her family had built, a name that was spoken with reverence and awe in every corner of the industry. I didn't think I stood a chance, not in a million years, but fate, it seems, has a peculiar sense of humor. An awkward, fumbling conversation about balance sheets and market volatility somehow turned into an invitation for coffee. That coffee turned into a series of dates, and those dates, against all odds, blossomed into love. Clara wasn't just the woman I fell for. She was the daughter of Arthur Sterling, the chairman of Sterling Investments, a man whose name was synonymous with power, influence, and old-world wealth. When I proposed to her, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the modest ring I had spent an entire year saving for. But she said yes, and in that moment, I felt like the luckiest man on the planet, a kid from Southie who had somehow won the lottery of life. A few months after our wedding, Arthur summoned me to his office on the top floor of the Sterling Investments building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that pierced the Boston skyline. I can still feel the frantic thumping of my heart against my ribs as I stood before that polished mahogany door. Arthur Sterling was a tall, imposing figure with a full head of silver hair and eyes as sharp and piercing as shards of ice. He looked me over, his expression unsmiling but not overtly hostile, more like a king assessing a new courtier. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone that seemed to fill the room. "You have talent, I can see that, and now that you're Clara's husband, I want you close to the family. I'm offering you the role of Chief Financial Officer at Sterling Investments." I was stunned into silence. CFO? Me? A kid from the rundown triple-deckers of South Boston? Now the chief financial officer of one of the most powerful holding companies in Massachusetts. I wanted to scream with joy, to run home and tell my parents, to shout from the rooftops that I had finally, truly made it. Instead, I managed a calm, steady nod. "Thank you, sir. I'm deeply honored," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I wasn't naive. I knew that being his son-in-law was a significant part of why I was chosen. But I also knew, with a certainty that burned in my gut, that I was good enough for the job. I threw myself into the work, laboring day and night, double-checking every number, scrutinizing every report, ensuring that everything was immaculate, pristine, and beyond reproach. I was desperate to prove that I wasn't just Clara Sterling's husband. I was Leo Vance, the man who had built himself from nothing. But not everyone in my wife's family saw it that way. The Sterling clan was a universe entirely foreign to me. Their sprawling estate in the Boston suburbs was so vast that I genuinely got lost in it once during a family gathering. The dinners were formal, suffocating affairs, filled with the clinking of antique silverware, the swirl of expensive wines, and conversations about stock portfolios in Europe, real estate ventures, or the maintenance of their yacht. It was all overwhelming. I tried my best to fit in, but I could feel the weight of their judgment every time I opened my mouth. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was the most formidable. With her flawlessly coiffed blonde hair held in place by jeweled clips, and a smile that never quite reached her cold blue eyes, she wielded her words like surgical instruments. She never said anything overtly cruel, but every comment was a thinly veiled jab. "Leo, where did you say you grew up again?" she would ask, her voice dripping with condescension. "Was it South Boston? Oh, how quaint that must have been," she'd remark, her tone implying I had crawled out from under a rock. I would just smile, nod, and swallow the insult, letting it settle like a stone in my stomach. Then there was Julian, Clara's older brother, the heir apparent who ran the company's investment division. From our very first meeting, he made it abundantly clear that he believed I didn't belong. He was tall, handsome, and always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my father's monthly salary. Julian had a way of speaking that made you feel small, insignificant. "You're doing quite well for yourself, Leo," he once said with a condescending smirk. For someone with your background, I knew he resented me. To Julian, I was an outsider, a charity case who had gotten lucky by marrying his prestigious sister. In the beginning, Clara was my rock, my anchor in that turbulent sea of wealth and privilege. On the nights I came home, emotionally exhausted from the family's withering glares and subtle insults, she would hold me and whisper, "Don't mind them, Leo. They just haven't gotten used to you yet." And I believed her. I wanted to believe that our love was strong enough to conquer anything. But sometimes, even she, with the best of intentions, would unintentionally wound me. At a family dinner one evening, when Eleanor was once again probing about my childhood in Southie, Clara laughed and said, "Oh, Leo has such rustic stories from his youth." Everyone chuckled, a polite, condescending sound that made me want to vanish from the room. The CFO position was a dream, but it was also a heavy burden. I worked relentlessly, not just to prove myself, but to protect the reputation of Sterling Investments. I meticulously reviewed every contract, every report, every single transaction. I wanted everything to be transparent, perfect. For the first few years at least, Arthur seemed pleased with my performance. He would call me into his office, clap me on the shoulder, and say, "You're doing a fine job, Leo. I didn't make a mistake." In those fleeting moments, I felt a flicker of belonging, but deep down, I knew I would never truly be a part of the Sterling family. Every time I tried to discuss business with Julian, he would give me curt, dismissive answers. Every time I tried to engage with Eleanor, she would find a way to remind me of my humble origins. I knew Clara still loved me, but I started to notice that she never defended me against her family. She would just remain silent, smile placidly, and let me face those invisible daggers alone. I used to think I was the lucky one, but I was beginning to realize that sometimes luck is just a gilded trap. I felt profoundly alone, even when surrounded by the most powerful people I had ever known. I found myself missing my old life in South Boston, missing the simple days of sitting on the porch with my dad, drinking cheap beer, and laughing with friends until late at night. In the world of sterling investments, I was just an outsider with a fancy title, a ghost in a machine I didn't understand. During my initial years as CFO, I was buoyed by the intoxicating feeling of recognition. My father-in-law, Arthur, would frequently summon me to his panoramic office, a warm hand on my shoulder, his words carefully chosen to make me believe I was on the right path. "You're part of this family now, Leo," he would say. His eyes sharp, but his voice imbued with a paternal warmth that almost made me believe I truly belonged. I buried myself in the work, scrutinizing every single digit, ensuring every financial statement was a testament to integrity. I was desperate to prove my worth, not just to Arthur but to myself. Then things began to shift. It wasn't a sudden storm, but a slow, insidious change, like a hairline crack in a wall that silently widens with each passing day. It began one late afternoon, as the fiery Boston sunset bled through my office window. Arthur called me in. He was sitting behind his enormous oak desk, a stack of documents in his hand, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes held a glint of something I hadn't seen before. "Leo," he began, his voice low and resolute, "we need to make some adjustments to the numbers in this quarterly report. Investor expectations are high, and it's our duty to meet them." I frowned, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Adjustments, sir, how so?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Arthur offered a smile I was beginning to recognize as disingenuous. "Just a bit of market confidence optimization, Leo. Boost the projected earnings by a few points. Add a little creativity to the figures. No one will dig too deep." He slid the documents across the polished desk toward me. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I took them back to my office and spread them out. The numbers. They were wrong. The profits were inflated. The asset values were exaggerated. I cross-referenced them with the raw data, and the truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't optimization. It was fraud. I wanted to believe he was testing me, that he would call me back in and explain it was all a mistake. But in the following days, the subtle requests continued. At a pre-briefing for an investor call, he instructed me to present information I knew was not transparent. "Don't get bogged down in the minutiae, Leo. The investors don't need to know everything," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Then he started passing me internal loan agreements that required my signature for approval. I read them and saw it immediately. They were phantoms. These loans didn't actually exist. They were merely a mechanism for sterling investments to create the illusion of liquidity for the shareholders. My hand trembled every time I signed one of those documents. I felt as if I were selling off a piece of my soul. I kept telling myself, just this once, just to keep the peace. But one time became another, and then another, until I began to see the horrifying full picture. Sterling Investments wasn't just a financial holding company. It was a sophisticated machine of deception, run by brilliant minds and concealed behind a glittering facade. The falsified reports, the manipulated figures, the empty promises, it was all part of a colossal Ponzi scheme, hidden beneath a veneer of charity galas and expensive suits. Arthur called it market confidence optimization, but I wasn't a fool. I knew I was being dragged into an ethical quagmire from which there might be no escape. Every night, I would lie in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Clara's breathing beside me, and stare at the ceiling, asking myself, what am I doing? Is this right? I tried to talk to Clara. I pulled her aside in the living room one evening after she returned from a charity gala. "Clara," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "do you know what's happening at the company? These reports, they aren't right. Your father is asking me to do things that are dishonest." I prayed she would take my side, that she would confront Arthur, that she would see the agony I was in. But Clara just looked at me, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them. "Leo, don't be so dramatic. My father knows what he's doing. He built this company from nothing. Do you really think you know better than him?" She turned her back on me, as if I'd said something utterly absurd. I stood there, feeling as if I'd been slapped. The woman I loved, the woman I thought would always be my ally, was siding with her family, leaving me to face the storm alone. I started losing sleep. Every morning, I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the man staring back. Leo Vance, the man who once believed in the power of integrity, the boy who had worked tirelessly to escape poverty, was now signing his name to fraudulent documents. I wondered if my parents, who had sacrificed everything to raise me, would still be proud of the man I had become. One day, as I was reviewing another report I knew to be false, Julian sauntered into my office. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "Looking stressed, Leo. Is being CFO really that hard?" His voice was laced with mockery. I wanted to stand up and scream in his face, to tell him I knew what his family was doing, but I remained silent, clenching my jaw and turning back to my work. I began to find ways to cope, to survive. I started making copies of the original documents, of Arthur's emails, of the meeting notes where these adjustments were discussed. I didn't know what I would do with them, but I felt a desperate need to collect evidence to protect myself. Or maybe deep down, I was hoping that one day I would find the courage to do the right thing. One evening, I drove out to the suburbs and parked by a small, quiet river. I sat on the hood of my car, watching the water flow silently under the moonlight. I thought about the days in South Boston, sitting on the porch with my dad, talking about our dreams. "Honesty, son," he used to say, "is the one thing nobody can ever take from you." But now, I felt like I was losing the very thing he had taught me to cherish. I didn't know what to do. If I stood up to Arthur, I would lose everything: my job, my family, the life I had built. But if I continued down this path, I would lose myself. I was at a crossroads. On one side was my integrity, on the other, my career and the happiness of my family. For the first time in my life, I was afraid, not of what I might lose, but of what I was becoming. I drove home and locked the copies of the documents in a small safe in my study. I didn't tell Clara, I didn't tell anyone, but I knew with a dreadful certainty that sooner or later I would have to face the truth. And when that day came, nothing would be able to save me from the coming storm. The subsequent days at Sterling Investments were suffocating. I felt as though I were walking on a sheet of thin ice, with the constant threat of it cracking beneath my feet. Every morning as I stepped into the gleaming glass building, I noticed the way my colleagues would avert their eyes. They still called me Mr. Vance, the CFO, but the title felt hollow, as if I were a ghost haunting the very company I was supposed to be managing. I wondered if they knew what was happening, or if they were simply following the orders of a man at the top, too afraid to question. Arthur maintained his veneer of paternal friendliness, but I noticed he began to keep me at a distance. Crucial meetings about investment strategies or budget allocations, things a CFO should have been at the very center of, were now happening without me. I once stumbled upon a meeting notice on a junior associate's calendar. When I asked my secretary about it, she stammered, "Oh, Mr. Vance, I believe that's just a minor internal huddle," but I knew the truth. I was being sidelined, pushed to the periphery, like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. My brother-in-law Julian was the one who made me feel this contempt most acutely. In one of the rare meetings I was still invited to, he stood at the front of the room presenting a new investment fund, never once making eye contact with me. When I tried to interject with a question about the fund's source of capital, he cut me off curtly. "I'll handle this part, Leo. You just worry about signing the reports." The room fell silent, and a few pairs of eyes darted toward me as if I had just been publicly slapped. I clenched my jaw and nodded, but inside, I wanted to slam my fist on the table and scream that I was not his puppet. Clara, the woman I loved, the woman I thought would always be my anchor, was drifting further away from me with each passing day. She was frequently away from home, citing charity functions or brief business trips with her family as an excuse. When I tried to ask for more details, her answers were vague and dismissive. "Don't worry about it, Leo. I'm just busy." But I knew better. I saw the way she looked at me now, not with the love and admiration of our early days, but with a flicker of frustration, as if I were a problem she didn't know how to solve. One night, when I tried to pull her aside to talk, she sighed and said, "Leo, you need to learn your place. Don't make things more complicated than they need to be." Her words were like a blade, twisting into my already wounded self-respect. Our 15th wedding anniversary was approaching. For weeks, I had been planning a romantic dinner at her favorite restaurant in downtown Boston, the very place where we had our first real date. I wanted to remind us both that even if everything else was falling apart, we still had each other. I booked the table, selected an expensive bottle of wine, and even wrote her a handwritten letter, something I hadn't done since the day I proposed. But on the morning of our anniversary, Clara walked into the room, phone in hand, and announced in a flat, emotionless tone, "Leo, I can't make it tonight. There's an emergency shareholder meeting. Dad needs me there. I was floored. A shareholder meeting? Why wasn't I told? I asked, struggling to keep my voice calm. She shrugged, as if it were of no consequence. It's just an internal family matter, Leo. You don't need to know. I stood there and watched her leave, the letter in my pocket suddenly feeling as heavy as a block of lead. That evening, I sat alone in our dark apartment, the unopened bottle of wine on the table, the city lights outside twinkling as if in mockery. I wondered if Clara was really at a meeting, or if it was just another excuse to avoid me. My heart ached, not just for the ruined anniversary, but for the stark realization that in the eyes of the Sterling family, I would never, ever be one of them. I started to feel like a caged animal, trapped by invisible bars. Every day at Sterling Investments was a fresh hell of Arthur's deceptive requests, Julian's sneering glances, and Clara's cold, impenetrable silence. I had no one to confide in. I missed my family, but they were back in South Boston, and I didn't want to drag them into this mess. I needed someone to talk to, someone who understood, someone who existed outside of this glittering, artificial world. That's when I called Ben Carter, an old friend from high school. Ben was now an assistant district attorney, a tough but scrupulously honest man. We met at a small, unassuming bar in a suburb where no one would recognize the CFO of Sterling Investments. Under the dim lights, with the soft strains of jazz playing in the background, I poured out everything. The fraudulent reports, the phantom loan agreements, the ethical swamp I was being pulled into with no idea how to get out. Leo, listen to me, Ben said, his voice low and serious. What you're describing isn't just optimization. It's felony fraud. If you keep signing those documents, you could be considered an accomplice. The chill ran down my spine. But if I stop, they'll destroy me, Ben. I'll lose everything. My job, my family, everything. Ben looked at me, his eyes filled with empathy, but also with unyielding resolve. You might lose everything, sure, but if you keep going, you'll lose yourself. Can you live with that? Ben's words were a wake-up call. I knew he was right, but I also knew I wasn't yet brave enough to act. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to release the suffocating helplessness that was choking me. But I just sat there, clutching my beer, steeped in my own solitude. When I got home that night, Clara still hadn't returned. I sat in my study, staring at the safe where I kept the copied documents. They were proof, but they were also a burden. I wondered if I had the strength to confront Arthur, to confront the Sterling family, to confront this entire world I had tried so hard to be a part of. I thought back to my days in South Boston, when I believed that hard work and honesty were the only things that mattered. Now, I was standing on the edge of a precipice with no way back. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and told myself, you have to do something, Leo. Not for them, for you. But I still didn't know what that something was. All I knew was that in this glittering world, I was utterly and completely alone. In the days following my conversation with Ben, I tried to hold myself together. But every step I took inside the world of Sterling Investments felt like another cut to my self-respect. I still went to the office, still signed the reports, still forced a smile when Arthur clapped me on the shoulder. But inside, I felt like I was disintegrating. Clara became even more distant, our conversations reduced to curt questions and cold nods. I wanted to grab her hand and ask if she still loved me, if any of it was still real. But every time I tried to start a conversation, the look in her eyes was a wall that stopped me cold. Then I heard that the Sterling family was planning a grand family gathering at their oceanfront estate on Martha's Vineyard. It was a lavish affair where family, close friends, and important business partners would convene to strengthen ties, and more importantly, to showcase their immense wealth. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this could be my chance to mend things, not just with Clara, but with her entire family. I wanted them to see me not as the charity case or the lucky freeloader, but as Leo Vance, the man who had worked his ass off to be where he was. But when I asked Clara about the event, one evening, she gave me a strange look, as if I had asked something I had no right to. Leo, she said, her voice flat, it's a family matter. You don't need to come. I was stunned, feeling the sting as if she had physically struck me. A family matter? I'm your husband, Clara. Am I not part of the family? I tried to keep my voice even, but my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. My face felt hot. Clara sighed and turned away, as if I were exhausting her. You need to know your place, Leo. Don't cause trouble. This isn't for you. Her words were a sharp, cold dagger that pierced right through my chest. I stood there as she walked out of the room, and for the first time, I truly wondered if our love was real, or just a fantasy I had constructed in my own mind. But I couldn't give up, not because I still held out hope for the Sterlings, but because I needed to do something to hold on to myself. I decided to go to the gathering, invited or not. I wanted to face them, not as the CFO or the son-in-law, but as Leo Vance, the man who loved Clara and had believed in this family. I prepared carefully. I brought an expensive bottle of wine I had been saving and a small photo album filled with memories of Clara and me, our wedding day, our trips, the times we had laughed together. I hoped these memories would remind them and remind Clara that I was not a stranger. The drive to Martha's vineyard took over 2 hours. The Sterling estate was magnificent, a palace perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Light spilled from the windows, and the sound of music and laughter drifted on the salty air. I stood at the door, clutching the wine and the album, my heart hammering. I told myself, just walk in, smile, say a few words, they'll understand, they have to. But as I approached the entrance, a security guard stopped me. "Name, sir?" he asked, his voice firm. I forced a confident smile. "Leo Vance, I'm Clara Sterling's husband." He looked at me, then at the list in his hand. "I don't see your name on the list, sir." My blood ran cold, but I pressed on. "There must be a mistake. I'm family. Please, just call for Clara or Mr. Sterling." The guard went inside, and moments later, he returned, followed by my mother-in-law, Eleanor, with Arthur trailing behind her. Eleanor was wearing a shimmering silk gown, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were glacial. Arthur stood behind her, his expression unreadable, though I caught a flicker of contempt in his gaze. "Leo," Eleanor said, her voice high and sharp, "what are you doing here? You were not invited." Her words were a public slap, and I heard a murmur ripple through the crowd of guests who had gathered near the doorway. I tried to remain calm, holding up the wine. I just wanted to celebrate with my family. I brought some wine and a few memories of Clara and me. Eleanor let out a short, cruel laugh, her smile failing to hide its viciousness. "Memories? Oh, Leo, do you really think you can buy your way in with a cheap bottle of wine and a few photographs? Do you really think you belong here?" She stepped closer, her voice low, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You are just a poor boy from South Boston, Leo. You got to where you are by riding on the coattails of your betters. Don't delude yourself into thinking you deserve to be here." My face was burning, and the world felt like it was watching me crumble. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, punctuated by a few stifled laughs. I looked past Eleanor and saw Clara, standing there in a radiant red dress, looking like a queen. I prayed she would step forward, say something, defend me, remind them that I was her husband. But she just stood there, her eyes averted, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Her silence hurt more than all of Eleanor's insults combined. Arthur spoke then, his voice low but commanding. "Go home, Leo. Don't make this any worse." He turned, ushering Eleanor back inside, and the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving me alone at the door. I heard someone whisper, "How embarrassing," followed by another laugh. The bottle of wine in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The photo album was useless. My self-respect was shattered, the pieces lying at my feet. I turned and walked back to my car, the weight of the world on my shoulders with every step. I sat in the driver's seat and looked back at the mansion, its lights still glowing, its music still playing. But I knew I didn't belong there. I had never belonged. I silently wiped away the tears that streamed down my face, tears not of shame, but of the dawning realization that the loyalty I had sacrificed everything to protect had never existed in the world of the Sterlings. That night, I didn't return to the apartment I shared with Clara. I drove to a small motel off the highway, a place where no one knew me. I sat on the creaky bed, still holding the bottle of wine. I opened the photo album. The pictures of Clara and me, her smile, our embrace on our wedding day. They now looked like framed lies. I wondered if she had ever truly loved me, or if I had just been a pawn in her family's game. I thought about my days in South Boston, where my parents had taught me about honesty and honor. I thought about my friend Ben, who had warned me about the pit I was in, and I thought about myself, Leo Vance, the man who once believed he could conquer the world, now a failure, betrayed by the very family he had joined. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time, felt a tiny spark ignite within me. It wasn't anger, but resolve. I could not continue to live like this. I could not let them turn me into a coward. I had to do something, not just to save myself, but to prove that I was not the man they thought I was. I put down the wine, closed the album, and told myself, "This isn't the end, Leo. You still have a fight left in you." But I knew that fight would not be easy, and the price I would have to pay could be everything I had. The next morning, I received a text from Clara. "Leo, where are you? Noah is asking for his father." Noah, my 10-year-old son, with his bright eyes and a smile that could melt any sorrow. Noah was the one reason I was still clinging to the fragments of this marriage. I replied tersely, "On my way. I'll be home soon." I didn't want Noah to worry. I didn't want him to be caught in the maelstrom I was facing. I drove back to Boston that afternoon with a heavy heart. When I walked into the apartment, I found Noah sitting on the sofa, clutching a picture book about spaceships. His face lit up in a radiant smile when he looked up. "Dad, where have you been for so long?" I knelt, pulled him into a hug, and tried to hide the ache in my soul. "Just visiting my old hometown, buddy. How are you?" Noah chattered on about school, about a science presentation he was preparing. I listened, letting his clear, innocent voice fill the emptiness in my heart. But that evening, as Noah was getting ready for bed, he spoke up, his voice suddenly hesitant. "Dad, I heard Grandpa on the phone yesterday." I froze. "What did he say, son?" I asked, my tone carefully neutral, though my heart was already pounding. Noah looked down, fiddling with his fingers as if he knew he was about to say something important. "He said that if there's an investigation, you'll take the fall for everything. He said you signed all the papers so no one can touch him." He looked up at me, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Dad, what's an investigation? Did you do something wrong?" It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. Noah's innocent, unfiltered words hit me like a fist to the chest. I put his glass of milk down on the table, knelt in front of him, and forced a calm expression. "No, buddy, I didn't do anything wrong. Don't you worry about it, okay? You just focus on your presentation." I ruffled his hair and managed a smile, but inside, I was trembling with a rage and fear so potent it was nauseating. After Noah was in bed, I collapsed into a chair, my mind racing. Arthur, the man I had once respected, the man who had supposedly made me, was now positioning me as the sacrificial lamb. The documents I had signed, the reports I had approved, the emails I had received, it was all a setup. I remembered the times Arthur had called me into his office, his voice gentle but firm. "Just sign here, Leo. You don't need to worry about a thing." I remembered the meetings I was excluded from. Julian's sneering glances, Clara's silence. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. They weren't just looking down on me. They were using me. I stood up and went to my study, opened the safe, and pulled out the stack of documents I had hidden. The fraudulent profit reports, the non-existent loan agreements, the emails containing Arthur's subtle but incriminating instructions. I read every line, every word, each one a blade confirming the truth. I had been betrayed, not just by Arthur, but by the entire Sterling family. Clara, the woman I loved, had surely known about this. Her silence at the gathering was not a coincidence. She had chosen her family over me, leaving me to face this humiliation and this deadly trap alone. I started to question everything. Every look, every word, every moment I had thought was genuine, now seemed like a performance. I thought of Clara's evasiveness, Julian's smirk, Eleanor's taunts about the poor boy. They hadn't just disdained my background. They disdained me as a human being, and now they were ready to make me the scapegoat to protect their empire. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, the desk lamp casting a harsh glow on the documents, as if they were daring me to act. I thought of Noah, of his clear eyes asking if I had done something wrong. I thought of my parents, who had taught me that integrity was the one thing no one could take from me. And I thought of my friend Ben, who had warned me that continuing down this path would cost me my soul. I realized I had nothing left to lose. My job was a sham. My in-laws had never seen me as one of them. The woman I loved had chosen her family over me. But I still had Noah, and I still had myself, or at least what was left of the Leo Vance, who once believed in justice and truth. A fire started to burn in my chest. I would not let Arthur win. I would not let them make me the fall guy while they continued to deceive and ruin the lives of others. I had to act, not for revenge, but for the simple reason that I wanted to be able to look in the mirror and recognize myself again. I took out a piece of paper and wrote down my next steps. First, I would go through all the documents again, cataloging every piece of evidence I could find. I would contact Ben, get his advice on how to legally approach a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude. And most importantly, I would protect Noah, ensure that he was shielded from the impending storm. I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me standing. I knew the road ahead would be treacherous, that I could lose everything I had left. But I also knew that if I didn't act, I would never forgive myself. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and told myself, it's time to fight back, Leo. Not for them, for Noah, and for you. The days following Noah's words were like walking a tightrope. Every step was a calculated risk, potentially the last one. His innocent but sharp comment, "Grandpa said you'll take the fall for everything," echoed in my mind like an alarm bell, a constant reminder that my time was running out. I was no longer Leo Vance, CFO at Sterling Investments, or Leo Vance, husband of Clara Sterling. I was just Leo, a man fighting to reclaim himself. I planned meticulously. I decided to confront Arthur, not to plead or bargain, but to get him to incriminate himself. I knew he was arrogant, self-assured, and I was going to use that pride against him. But I also knew that if I failed, I would lose everything. I thought of Noah, of his bright smile, and told myself I could not let my son grow up with a coward for a father. That morning, I walked into the Sterling Investments building with a strange mix of terror and relief. I wore my best suit, not to impress, but to remind myself that I was still a man of dignity. In my pocket, a small digital recorder sat like a silent ally. I took a deep breath, pressed the elevator button, and rode up to the top floor where Arthur's office reigned. His secretary, a young woman with a forced smile, looked up at me in surprise. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Sterling is busy. Do you have an appointment?" I smiled, trying to appear calm. "No, but it's important. I'll wait." I sat in the hallway, my hands clasped, feeling the recorder in my pocket as a point of no return. After a few minutes, the office door opened and Arthur appeared, as imposing as ever, tall, with his silver hair and piercing eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice even. "Come in. What is it?" I stepped into the vast room with its panoramic views of Boston Harbor and heard the door click shut behind me. I knew this was the moment of truth. With a swift, discreet movement, I activated the recorder in my pocket and then sat down opposite Arthur's desk. He looked at me, a hint of a smirk on his lips. "You look tense, Leo. Is there a problem?" My heart was hammering, but I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "Arthur, I want to talk about the reports we've been working on. The numbers, they're not right. I know you call it optimization, but we both know the truth. It's fraud. I want it to stop." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Then he chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "Fraud? That's a strong word, Leo. This is business. Don't you understand? We do what's necessary to maintain investor confidence. Did you really think this company grew on clean numbers?" He paused, looking at me as if I were a naive child. "You've signed everything, Leo. You're a part of this. Don't play the saint now." My face burned, but I kept my composure, prodding him to continue, mentioning past deals. "I'm thinking of last quarter's report, Arthur. You asked me to inflate the projected earnings by 12%, and those internal loan agreements, they're non-existent. You know what the SEC would find if they investigated, don't you?" I specifically mentioned the SEC, watching for his reaction. Arthur didn't flinch. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city like a king surveying his domain. "You worry too much, Leo. The SEC will only see what we want them to see. And if there's an investigation, guess who takes the fall?" He turned, his eyes sharp as daggers. Your name is on everything. The reports, the contracts, the emails. You're the CFO, Leo. You're the one responsible. His words landed like a sledgehammer. I thought of Noah, of his innocent words, and realized Arthur wasn't just threatening me. He had planned this from the very beginning. My hand trembled in my pocket, but I kept my voice steady. I don't want to do this anymore, Arthur. I won't be a part of it. You need to stop, or I will, or you'll what? Arthur cut in, his voice low and menacing. He took a step toward me, towering over me. Who do you think you are, Leo? Without me, you'd still be some no-name accountant from South Boston. I made you, and I can unmake you in an instant. You owe me everything. Your job, your reputation, your power, your income, your luxury apartment, your beautiful wife, your smart kid. It's all because of me. You think you can fight me? I was stunned, not by the threat, but by the sheer audacity of it. He didn't see me as his son-in-law, as family. I was just a pawn, a tool to be used and discarded. I wanted to stand up and scream at him, but I knew I had to stay calm. The recorder was still running, and I needed him to say more, to confess more. So, what do you want me to do? I asked, deliberately making my voice sound defeated. Keep signing? Keep protecting you? What if I don't? Arthur laughed, a smug, triumphant sound. You will sign, Leo, because if you don't, you will lose everything. Not just your job. You'll lose Clara. You'll lose Noah. You'll lose this home. You'll lose your reputation. You'll go back to South Boston with nothing, and no one will even remember your name. Choose, Leo. Loyalty or foolishness? I bowed my head, pretending to consider, but inside I knew I had what I needed. The recording in my pocket was capturing it all. Arthur's admission of the fraudulent deals, his threats, his plan to frame me. I stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, I'll think about it, Arthur. But you should know, I'm not as easy to control as you think. He smirked as if I were an annoying fly he could swat away. You know the way out, Leo. Don't make me repeat myself. I walked out of his office, my steps more certain than I had expected. As the elevator doors closed, I checked the recorder. The audio was clear, every one of Arthur's words captured like a bullet. My heart was still racing, but I allowed myself a small, grim smile. It was the first step, but I knew the real war had only just begun. That night in my study, I listened to the recording over and over. Every word from Arthur was a knife, reminding me of the betrayal. I thought of Clara, her silence during my humiliation, her choice to side with her family. I thought of Noah, and I knew I had to see this through. Not just to save myself, but to protect my son from this world of deceit. I locked the recorder in the safe with the other documents. I knew what I had to do next. My friend Ben at the DA's office was the man I needed to see, but I also knew that once I started down this path, there would be no turning back. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and told myself, you have the proof, Leo. Now let justice do its work. The days after my confrontation with Arthur were a struggle to maintain a facade of normalcy. Inside, I was a volcano ready to erupt. Every time I saw Clara, I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she had betrayed me, why she had left me alone in her family's trap. But I held my tongue. I knew my moment was coming, and I couldn't let emotion ruin everything. On a morning of drizzling rain, with the Boston sky as gray as my mood, I contacted Ben. Ben, I need to see you. I said over the phone, it's serious. Ben didn't ask questions. He just replied, my office, 3 p.m. Bring whatever you have. His seriousness gave me a flicker of hope. Ben was the one person I could trust, the one person untouched by the Sterling's world of deceit. I prepared meticulously. I copied all the documents and put them in an envelope that felt like a bomb, capable of destroying my world. Before I left the apartment, I looked at Noah, who was playing with a model spaceship in the living room. He looked up with a bright smile. Going to work, Dad. I'll be back soon. I want to tell you about my science project. I hugged him tighter than usual and whispered, I'll be back soon, buddy. I promise. But inside, I knew I was walking into a battle from which I might not return unchanged. Ben's office was in an old, unpretentious building downtown, a stark contrast to the opulence of Sterling Investments. But it had an air of integrity that I craved. Ben was sitting behind his desk, his hair disheveled, his glasses slipping down his nose, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Talk to me, Leo, he said, no preamble. What kind of trouble are you in? I placed the envelope on his desk, my hand trembling slightly. This is everything, Ben. It's proof that Sterling Investments is running a Ponzi scheme. Fake reports, phantom contracts, and a recording of Arthur confessing to everything. He's planning to frame me if there's an investigation. I told him the whole story, Arthur's subtle requests, the pressure to sign, Noah's words, the humiliation at the family gathering. Ben listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When I played the recording for him, I saw Ben's eyes narrow. His lips tighten into a thin line. "Leo, this could bring down an empire," he said, his voice low but firm. "But you have to understand, if I take this to the SEC, everything changes. The company will be investigated, their stock will plummet, and you could be caught in the crossfire. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked at Ben, thinking of Noah, of my parents, of the sleepless nights spent racked with guilt. "I'm sure," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can't live with this cover-up anymore. Not for me, but for Noah. I want my son to know his father wasn't a coward." Ben nodded and put a hand on my shoulder. "All right, Leo. I'll take this to the SEC, and I'll make sure it's handled properly. But prepare yourself. The Sterlings won't go down quietly when this breaks." I knew he was right. Arthur, Julian, and even Clara, they would do anything to protect their empire, even if it meant destroying me. Before I left his office, I took one final step. I sent copies of all the evidence, the documents, the emails, the recording, to a lawyer Ben recommended and to an investigative journalist I trusted at a major newspaper. I wasn't going to let Arthur control the narrative. If he wanted to play dirty, I would play first. Days later, the news broke like a thunderclap. The SEC announced a public investigation into Sterling Investments for suspected large-scale financial fraud. The company's stock, once a blue-chip darling, plummeted from its peak to a record low in a matter of hours. News channels broadcast images of the Sterling Investments headquarters being cordoned off, employees coming and going in a state of panic. I sat in my apartment watching the television, feeling as if I were witnessing the collapse of another world. But I didn't feel happy. I felt a sense of profound relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from my chest. Arthur was called in for questioning. Julian, as expected, began spreading a counter-narrative, leaking stories that I, Leo Vance, was the rogue actor, that I had manipulated the financials for personal gain, abusing my position as CFO. I read the accusations in one article and felt a familiar surge of anger, but I wasn't scared. I had already released the evidence to the media and the SEC before they could spin their lies. Arthur's arrogant voice and his threats were featured in a major article titled, "Sterling Investments Chairman Admits to Fraud on Secret Recording." I knew Arthur and Julian were trying to frame me, but it was too late. The wheels of justice, though slow, had begun to turn. I sat in my study, looking at the now empty safe, and told myself, "You did it, Leo. You fought back." The Sterling family was engulfed in chaos. In the days following the SEC investigation, their estate on Martha's Vineyard became a media circus. Reporters camped outside, their cameras trained on every door as if awaiting a spectacular implosion. Arthur was placed under house arrest, pending formal charges. Julian appeared on television, offering shaky denials, his eyes darting nervously as he tried to salvage their image. Eleanor, the woman who had once publicly humiliated me, was now a recluse, hiding from the press like a wounded animal in her mansion. I wasn't surprised that Julian and his allies tried to pin the blame on me. They sent out emails to shareholders, claiming I had acted alone, that I was a rogue employee who had falsified reports for personal gain. But their lies unraveled quickly. The copies of the documents and the recording I had sent to the media and the SEC became my most powerful weapons. News outlets quoted Arthur repeatedly. "You've signed everything, Leo. You're the one responsible." Those same words he had used to threaten me had now become the noose around his own neck. One evening, I returned to the apartment after several days of staying elsewhere. When I walked in, Clara was sitting in the living room. She stood up when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." There was none of the arrogant poise of a Sterling heiress now. "You don't understand, Leo. I didn't want it to be like this. Dad, he was just trying to protect the family. Can't you stop this? Tell the SEC it was a misunderstanding. I'm begging you. For Noah, for us." I looked at the woman I had once loved more than life itself, and I felt a void where my heart used to beat for her. "Clara," I said, my voice eerily calm, "you stood by while they tried to destroy me. You were silent at the gathering when your mother humiliated me. You knew your father planned to make me the scapegoat, and you said nothing. Now you're begging for your family, but you never once stood up for me. Let justice take its course." Clara broke down in sobs, stepping closer, her voice pleading. "Leo, I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose Noah. Can't you see? We can fix this. Just tell them you were wrong. Retract the evidence. We can be like we were before." She reached for my hand, but I slowly pulled it back, shaking my head. "Like we were before?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "Like when you let your mother call me a poor boy in front of everyone? Like when you stayed silent, knowing your father was setting a trap for me?" "It's too late for apologies, Clara. You chose your family, and I chose the truth." Her face hardened, the tears stopping, as a flash of anger I had never seen before crossed her eyes. "So that's it, Leo?" she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You think you're so noble? You think you can just destroy my family and walk away as if nothing happened? Get out of my house. Get out right now." She pointed to the door, her face flushed, as if I were a stranger who had trespassed in her home. Noah heard the shouting and came running downstairs, his wide eyes filled with fear. "Mom, Dad, don't fight," he cried, his voice trembling. I stepped forward, hugged him, and tried to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, Noah. Come with Dad. It's all right." Noah nodded, clutching my hand tightly, but Clara stepped between us, pushing me away from our son. "No," she yelled, her voice nearly a shriek. "You can't take Noah. He's my son. You have no right." She pulled Noah toward her, but Noah wriggled free and ran to me. "I want to go with Dad," he sobbed, clinging to me. My heart was breaking, but I knew I couldn't let Clara keep our son in that world of deceit. "Clara," I said firmly, "I will not let Noah be raised in a family that values money more than truth. I'm taking him, and you can't stop me." I took Noah's hand and walked to the door. Clara screamed behind me, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. "You'll regret this, Leo. You will lose everything." But I didn't look back. I led Noah out of the apartment as her sobs echoed behind the closed door. I took Noah to a small motel in the suburbs. He sat on the bed, clutching his model spaceship, his eyes still red. "Dad, is Mom angry with me?" he asked, his voice small. I hugged him and whispered, "No, buddy. Mom is just sad, but I promise I will always be here for you." Noah nodded, snuggling into me, and I felt a resolve stronger than I had ever known. I would protect my son, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Investments collapsed completely. The company was forced into receivership. Many employees were laid off, and Arthur was facing a battery of fraud charges. Julian tried to evade responsibility, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Estelle, the woman who had once called me a poor boy, became a figure of ridicule in the press. The Sterling family, once a symbol of power, was now a cautionary tale of greed and deception. I decided to take Noah to my parents' house in South Boston. The old house was just as I remembered it, with its creaky wooden floors and the smell of my mother's coffee brewing every morning. My parents welcomed us with tight hugs, asking few questions, but I knew they understood. One evening, as we sat on the porch, my father said, "Son, you did the right thing, no matter how hard it was. You held on to your integrity. I'm proud of you." His words were like a balm, healing wounds I thought would never close. Noah, my bright-eyed 10-year-old son, was quieter than usual at first. I knew he missed his mother and the luxury of our Boston apartment. But I tried to fill that void with love and sincerity. I took him fishing in the river near the house, taught him how to fix a bicycle, and told him stories of my own childhood there. Slowly, I saw Noah's smile return. Every time he hugged me, I knew I had made the right choice. While Noah and I started a new life in South Boston, my father-in-law, Arthur, remained under house arrest, awaiting trial. The news reported that he rarely left his mansion, a ghost surrounded by lawyers and the whispers of the press. Philip was forced to resign and face charges of complicity. His once polished exterior now a shadow of its former self. Estelle was no longer concerned with glamorous galas, and as for Clara, I hadn't heard from her since the day I left the apartment with Noah. I didn't know what she was doing, but I knew she was no longer a part of my life. Through my lawyer, I filed for divorce, requesting full custody of Noah. She didn't contest it, perhaps because she knew it was a battle she had already lost. The first few months in South Boston were a time of deep reflection. I spent hours alone, thinking about what had happened, about the choices I had made. Some nights I would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by dreams of Arthur's cold eyes or Clara's screams. But every morning, when I saw Noah running in the yard, I knew I had chosen the right path. I was no longer the CFO of Sterling Investments, no longer the husband of Clara Sterling. I was just Leo Vance, a father, a son, and a man trying to rediscover himself. A year later, I decided to start over. I opened a small financial consulting office in South Boston, in a modest room on the city's main street. I called it Palmer Financial Solutions. It was simple, unpretentious, but it was mine. My philosophy was clear. Integrity was the #1 rule. I worked with small businesses, working-class families, people like my old self, with little money but big dreams. I meticulously checked every number, ensured everything was transparent, and turned away any client who wanted to take the path of Arthur Sterling. Every contract I signed, every report I sent, was a declaration that I was no one's pawn anymore. The media began to take notice. One article hailed me as the CFO who stood for the truth, and others followed. They wrote about my journey from a poor boy in South Boston to the man who brought down a fraudulent financial empire. I didn't want the spotlight, but I didn't shy away from interviews either. I wanted my story to be a warning, a reminder that greed can destroy everything, and that honesty, however painful, is the only way to live true to oneself. One evening, as I was organizing papers in my office, a young reporter called and asked what advice I would give to those facing injustice. I thought about the days when I was pressured to sign fraudulent reports, the nights I lay awake in agony, and I said, don't let anyone, no matter how powerful, force you to betray your conscience. Stand up, even if it means losing everything, because nothing is more valuable than yourself. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the streetlights twinkling in the dark. I thought of Noah, asleep in the small room at my parents' house. I thought of my parents, who had taught me honesty from a young age. And I thought of myself, the man who had almost lost everything, chasing a glittering dream. One morning, Noah and I were walking along the riverbank near the house. He was drawing circles in the dirt with a stick and asked, "Dad, are you happy?" I knelt, looked into his bright eyes and smiled. "Yes, buddy, I'm happy because I have you, and because I did the right thing." As the sun rose, painting the river in gold, I held Noah's hand and felt the freedom I had gained by sacrificing everything. I had lost a glamorous life, a wife, a powerful family, but I had found myself again, and I knew that was the greatest victory of all. "Sometimes, Noah," I said, looking out at the horizon, "losing everything is the only way to get yourself back." Asterisk.